Have you ever noticed how the moments you strive hardest for flawlessness are precisely when life feels most hollow? There's a peculiar emptiness that arrives when we chase perfection, a void that expands in direct proportion to our pursuit of the immaculate. I remember standing before a project I had revised 17 times, feeling nothing but a strange disconnection, as though the more I polished, the further I drifted from the original spark that once gave it meaning. This paradox lives within so many of us. The more desperately we chase the perfect version of our work, our relationships, ourselves, the more profoundly we feel the weight of our own inadequacy pressing against our chest at 3 a.m., whispering that despite everything, we remain fundamentally insufficient. The first lie of perfectionism speaks in a voice so familiar, we mistake it for our own conscience. It whispers that our worth exists on the far side of flawlessness, that we are valuable only to the extent that we eliminate our human limitations. We internalize this voice so completely that we no longer recognize its foreign origin, how it was constructed from fragments of childhood criticisms, societal expectations, and wounds we've collected along the way. The perfectionist doesn't simply want to do well. They are haunted by the terror that anything less than excellence reveals an unforgivable truth about who they fundamentally are. Behind closed doors, the perfectionist lives in a state of perpetual trial, serving as both the accused and the merciless judge. Each task becomes not merely something to complete, but a referendum on their very right to exist without shame. The report that needs one more revision, the home that's never quite organized enough, the body that's always 5 pounds from acceptable. These aren't simply projects, but proxy battles in a war against an elusive sense of inner deficiency that no external achievement seems capable of silencing. What remains unspoken is how perfectionism functions not as a path to excellence, but as an elaborate defense mechanism. It protects us from the vulnerability of being seen in our authentic, messy humanity. We believe we're pursuing greatness, but we're often running from the imagined catastrophe of being ordinary, of being exposed as merely human in a world that seems to demand superhuman performance. The perfectionist doesn't fear failure so much as they fear being revealed, the terror that others might glimpse the gap between the curated self and the human being beneath the carefully maintained facade. The body keeps the score of this relentless self-judgment. Tension headaches that arrive like clockwork, the stomach that knots before presentations, the grinding of teeth during sleep. These are the physical manifestations of a mind that never grants itself amnesty. The perfectionist's body exists in a state of perpetual readiness, braced against the anticipated pain of inevitable inadequacy. Even moments of achievement provide no real relief, only a temporary reprieve before the standards invisibly elevate once again, maintaining the same distance between the self and the ever-receding horizon of enough. Nietzsche understood this trap when he wrote that the most common form of human stupidity is forgetting what one is trying to do. The perfectionist has long forgotten that the original purpose of their striving was likely joy, contribution, or expression. Instead, the means have become the end. The pursuit of flawlessness has replaced the pursuit of meaning. The metrics have overtaken the mission. The perfectionist finds themselves climbing faster and faster up a ladder, only to discover it's leaning against the wrong wall entirely. Consider the artist who no longer creates because beginning means confronting imperfection. The writer with dozens of unfinished drafts, but nothing submitted. The parent exhausted by the impossible standards of raising the perfect child. These are not merely cases of high standards, but of people caught in perfectionism's paralyzing grip, unable to move forward because movement itself implies the risk of falling short. Their potential remains tragically unrealized, not despite their perfectionism, but because of it. What would it feel like to wake tomorrow without the weight of your own impossible expectations? To move through the day without the constant internal commentary measuring the gap between what is and what should be? Most perfectionists cannot even imagine this freedom. The absence of their critical inner voice feels not like liberation, but like a dangerous abandonment of standards, as though without the whip of self-criticism, they would dissolve into mediocrity or worse, irrelevance. The most insidious aspect of perfectionism is how it masquerades as virtue. We praise the student who stays up all night refining their work, the employee who answers emails at midnight, the friend who apologizes for invisible offenses. Society rewards the outward manifestations of this inner tyranny, never seeing the psychological cost or recognizing that what appears as dedication is often desperation, a frantic attempt to outrun the shadow of perceived inadequacy that no amount of achievement can ever escape. Perhaps Kierkegaard came closest to naming the existential core of perfectionism when he spoke of the despair of not wanting to be oneself. The perfectionist's struggle is fundamentally one of self-rejection, a deep, often unconscious belief that who they naturally are remains insufficient. Their perfectionism is not merely a preference for excellence, but a desperate attempt to escape the perceived inadequacy of their authentic being. Each achievement becomes not a celebration, but a temporary barricade against the feared truth of their own insufficiency. The perfectionist lives in what Camus might recognize as absurdity, caught between the human need for meaning and clarity and the universe's indifference to our standards. They impose rigid order on a fundamentally chaotic existence, creating elaborate systems of control that provide the illusion of certainty in an uncertain world. The perfectly organized home, the flawless presentation, the immaculate appearance, these become talismans against the fundamental disorder of existence, attempts to create islands of perfect control in life's unpredictable sea. Jung would recognize in perfectionism the shadow rejected the disowned aspects of self that we refuse to acknowledge or integrate. The perfectionist has banished their own limitations, vulnerabilities, and messiness to the shadow realm, creating an internal split that demands enormous psychological energy to maintain. What they fail to understand is that this rejected shadow doesn't disappear, but grows stronger in its exile, eventually manifesting as anxiety, depression, or the peculiar emptiness that follows even their greatest achievements. Consider how perfectionism functions as a form of existential avoidance. By focusing obsessively on the details, the perfect word choice, the flawless execution, the immaculate appearance, the perfectionist distracts themselves from deeper questions of purpose and meaning. The exhausting pursuit of flawlessness leaves little energy for confronting the more profound questions. Not whether something is perfect, but whether it matters at all. Not whether one has achieved enough, but whether one is pursuing achievements aligned with their authentic values. The tragedy lies in how perfectionism promises exactly what it makes impossible, the very excellence it claims to pursue. True mastery in any domain requires experimentation, failure, and the willingness to exist in the uncomfortable space of not knowing. The pianist must play wrong notes to eventually play right ones. The scientist must formulate incorrect hypotheses on the path to discovery. The perfectionist, paralyzed by the fear of these necessary imperfections, often remains trapped in mediocrity precisely because they cannot bear the messy process that excellence demands. Viktor Frankl might observe how perfectionism represents a fundamental misunderstanding of human value. The perfectionist has unconsciously accepted the premise that human worth must be earned through flawless performance rather than recognized as inherent. They live as though constantly auditioning for the right to exist without apology. What Frankl understood after surviving the concentration camps was that human dignity exists prior to and independent of achievement, a truth the perfectionist intellectually knows but emotionally cannot accept. There is a particular kind of suffering in the gap between the perfectionist's ideal self and their lived reality, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, but what feels more like a persistent, low-grade despair. Each day becomes evidence of how they have fallen short of their own impossible standards. The perfectionist doesn't merely fail at tasks. They experience each imperfection as confirmation of a deeper, more personal failure, evidence that confirms their worst fears about themselves. What would Nietzsche say to the perfectionist? Perhaps that they have created a prison of their own ideals, that their pursuit of perfection represents not strength, but a failure of courage. The courage to embrace life in all its messy imperfection, to say yes to existence as it is, rather than as they believe it should be. The truly strong spirit, he might suggest, is not the one who achieves perfection, but the one who can love life despite its fundamental imperfectibility. There comes a moment in many perfectionists' lives, often after burnout, illness, or some personal crisis, when the elaborate architecture of their standards begins to reveal its true cost. Like a building whose foundation has been silently crumbling, the collapse often appears sudden, but has been years in the making. The executive who finds herself unable to get out of bed one morning. The student whose anxiety attacks become too frequent to ignore. The parent who realizes they've been so focused on creating perfect children that they've missed the joy of simply being with them. These breaking points aren't failures, but the first honest communication from a self that has been silenced too long. What if perfectionism has never actually been about achieving excellence, but about avoiding vulnerability? Consider this possibility: that beneath the pursuit of flawlessness lies a child who learned that love was conditional, that acceptance came only with achievement, that mistakes were shameful rather than instructive. The perfectionist's standards didn't emerge from a vacuum, but from early lessons about what made them worthy of connection, approval, or safety. The revelation isn't that they've failed at being perfect, it's that perfection was always an impossible substitute for what they truly needed: the experience of being accepted in their wholeness, flaws, and all. The first tremors of awakening often arrive as questions that the perfectionist has never allowed themselves to ask. What if I allowed myself to be merely good enough at some things to be truly exceptional at others? What if I've been measuring my worth with entirely the wrong metrics? What if the energy I've spent hiding my imperfections could be redirected toward genuine growth? These questions feel dangerous precisely because they threaten the familiar, if uncomfortable, identity built around perfectionism. They suggest another way of being that the perfectionist both longs for and fears. There is a particular grief that accompanies this awakening morning for the years spent chasing an impossible standard, for the opportunities declined because I wasn't ready yet, for the joy sacrificed at perfectionism's altar. This grief isn't weakness, but clarity, the necessary recognition of what has been lost before something new can be built. The perfectionist must grieve the idealized self they've pursued before they can embrace the complex, imperfect human they actually are. The body often leads this revolution against perfectionism's regime. The panic attacks, insomnia, chronic pain, or exhaustion aren't merely inconvenient symptoms, but communications from a self that can no longer sustain the perfect performance. When the perfectionist finally listens to these signals, not as failures to overcome, but as wisdom to heed, something shifts. The body, so long treated as an instrument to be controlled or an object to be perfected, becomes instead a source of intelligence, a compass pointing toward a more sustainable way of being. What does it mean to question the voice of perfectionism after having followed its commands for so long? It means developing the capacity to notice the critical inner monologue without automatically accepting its judgments as truth. It means asking, with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness, is this standard actually mine, or have I inherited it? Does this pursuit align with what I truly value, or am I chasing external validation? Would I impose these expectations on someone I love, or only on myself? These questions create the first cracks in perfectionism's previously impenetrable logic. The most profound awakening comes not from achieving more, but from recognizing the fundamental sufficiency of who you already are. This isn't complacency or surrender, but the revolutionary act of reclaiming your intrinsic worth from a system that convinced you it must be earned through flawless performance. It's the quiet realization that you were never actually the problem. The problem was the impossible standard against which you've been measuring yourself, a standard designed to keep you perpetually falling short, perpetually striving, perpetually consuming solutions to a manufactured deficiency. Can you recall a moment when you were fully absorbed in something creating, connecting, experiencing, and the voice of perfectionism fell silent? Those moments of flow, of presence, offer glimpses of life beyond perfectionism's grip. They reveal that excellence doesn't require the punishing inner critic, but often emerges precisely when that critic steps aside. What if those moments weren't accidental, but could become more intentional? What if the path to your best work and most meaningful life runs directly through embracing your limitations rather than denying them? There exists a strength that perfectionists rarely recognize in themselves. The profound resilience required to constantly fall short of impossible standards and still rise each morning to try again. Consider the endurance this requires to live beneath the weight of your own disapproval day after day, to weather the constant internal criticism that would crush someone who heard it from an external source. This persistence, though currently misdirected, represents a well of determination that, once redirected toward more compassionate aims, becomes a formidable force for genuine growth rather than illusory perfection. The Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold, offers a powerful metaphor for a different relationship with imperfection. Rather than disguising the breaks, kintsugi highlights them, creating something more beautiful and valuable than the original unblemished vessel. What might it mean to approach your own fractures this way? Not as flaws to be hidden, but as unique contours that give your life its particular character and beauty. As evidence not of failure, but of having lived authentically in a world that demands vulnerability as the price of genuine connection. Real mastery in any domain emerges not from avoiding mistakes, but from making them abundantly, learning voraciously from each one. The concert pianist has played thousands of wrong notes on the path to virtuosity. The writer has produced mountains of mediocre pages to arrive at a single transcendent paragraph. The surgeon's hands have trembled before they steadied. What perfectionists fail to recognize is that the masters they admire aren't those who avoided error, but those who moved through it without being defined by it, who understood that imperfection isn't the opposite of excellence, but its prerequisite. There is a particular kind of wisdom that lives only in the territory of acknowledged limitation. When we finally accept that we cannot be everything, know everything, excel at everything, a curious liberation occurs. Energy previously scattered across 1,000 points of possible failure consolidates around what matters most. Priorities clarify. The perfectionist who tried to be exceptional in every domain discovers the power of being deliberately, strategically imperfect in many areas to be truly outstanding in a few that align with their deepest values and natural strengths. Consider the relationships that have most profoundly nourished you. Were they with people who presented flawless facades, or with those who allowed you to see their struggles, their doubts, their authentic humanity? Our deepest connections form not around our perfections, but around our shared vulnerability. The perfectionist, believing they must hide their flaws to be worthy of love, creates precisely the barrier that prevents the very connection they seek. The revelation comes in discovering that what they've been hiding is exactly what would allow others to truly see and accept them. There exists a quiet dignity in acknowledging limits that perfectionists rarely allow themselves to experience. It lives in the simple truth of saying, "I don't know," without shame, in admitting, "I made a mistake," without self-flagellation, in recognizing, "I need help," without seeing it as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. This dignity doesn't require exceptional achievement or flawless performance. It requires only the courage to be seen as you are, to occupy your life without apology or excessive explanation, to stand in your complete humanity rather than hiding behind the partial self that perfectionism allows you to reveal. The most profound resilience isn't found in never falling, but in how we speak to ourselves when we do. The perfectionist berates themselves for their failures, creating a double wound, the initial setback compounded by their own harsh judgment. A different possibility exists, meeting disappointment with the same compassion we would offer a friend, recognizing the universal humanity in struggle rather than seeing it as a personal deficiency. This self-compassion isn't self-indulgence, but the foundation of genuine resilience, the ability to fail, learn, and continue without being diminished by the inevitable imperfections along any meaningful path. What if your imperfections are not problems to be solved, but invitations to a more authentic life? The anxiety that seems like weakness might actually be sensitivity that, once embraced, becomes extraordinary empathy. The perfectionism that manifests as rigidity might, when transformed, become a gift for creating necessary structure. The self-doubt that feels like a burden might be the very thing that keeps you ethical, thoughtful, and open to growth. What if nothing about you needs to be eradicated, but rather understood, integrated, and directed toward its highest expression? The most profound freedom doesn't arrive when you finally achieve perfection. It comes when you no longer need it. Imagine waking up tomorrow without the compulsion to prove your worth through flawless performance, without the exhausting vigilance against potential failure, without the constant internal measurement against impossible standards. This isn't lowering your standards, but transforming your relationship to them from prison warden to compassionate guide, from harsh judge to curious explorer. Excellence remains possible, perhaps even more accessible, when pursued not from fear of inadequacy, but from authentic engagement with what matters. There is a particular quality of presence that becomes available only when we release the perfectionist's constant orientation toward the future ideal. The mind that's always comparing what is to what should be cannot fully inhabit the moment as it unfolds. The perfectionist lives in a perpetual state of not yet good enough, not yet ready, not yet worthy. The liberation comes in discovering that life only ever happens now, in this imperfect moment, and that waiting to fully arrive until some future state of flawlessness means never truly arriving at all. Presence isn't achieved through perfection, but through the willingness to be exactly where and who you are. Consider what becomes possible when the energy previously consumed by perfectionism's demands is reclaimed. The mental bandwidth spent on self-criticism becomes available for creativity. The emotional resources drained by constant self-judgment can be redirected toward meaningful connection. The physical tension of perpetual vigilance releases, allowing access to intuition and embodied wisdom previously drowned out by perfectionism's incessant noise. This isn't merely an absence of suffering, but the presence of capacities that perfectionism has long suppressed: spontaneity, playfulness, genuine curiosity, and the ability to take risks without existential dread. The path beyond perfectionism isn't found in grand declarations, but in small daily acts of courageous imperfection. Sending the email with a minor typo rather than reviewing it for the 7th time. Sharing the imperfect draft with a trusted colleague. Allowing yourself to be seen in a moment of not knowing. Speaking the truth of your experience without first polishing it to palatability. Each of these moments creates evidence that contradicts perfectionism's central lie, that imperfection leads to rejection, failure, or catastrophe. Instead, you discover that authenticity creates connection, that vulnerability generates trust, that imperfect action leads to growth impossible through endless preparation. What emerges beyond perfectionism isn't carelessness, but a more nuanced, mature relationship with quality and effort. You learn to distinguish between excellence that matters and perfectionism that doesn't. Between the careful work that honors your values and the obsessive polishing that merely soothes your anxiety. You develop the wisdom to know when good enough truly is, when diminishing returns have set in, when additional effort serves only to feed the perfectionist's insatiable hunger rather than adding meaningful value. This discernment isn't compromise, but clarity about where your finite energy belongs. The most liberating truth awaiting beyond perfectionism's walls is that you were never actually broken. The sense of fundamental deficiency that drove the perfectionist's striving was itself the illusion, a misinterpretation of normal human limitation as evidence of personal inadequacy. The pursuit of perfection was always an attempt to solve a problem that didn't exist, to fix what wasn't broken, to earn what was already yours. The freedom comes not from becoming perfect, but from recognizing the fundamental wholeness that has been there all along, beneath the perfectionist's constant self-improvement projects. There is profound relief in discovering that you don't need to be exceptional to be worthy of love, respect, or belonging. The ordinary humanity you've been trying to transcend through perfectionism is precisely what connects you to others. Your struggles, doubts, and imperfections aren't barriers to meaningful connection, but the very ground from which it grows. The parts of yourself you've worked hardest to hide or fix are often the very aspects that, when finally acknowledged, allow others to truly see and accept you, not despite your imperfections, but including them in the complete picture of who you are. The final liberation from perfectionism comes not as a rival at some perfect state, but as a continuous practice of returning to self-compassion when the old patterns resurface, as they inevitably will. The perfectionist voice doesn't disappear entirely, but gradually loses its authority as you develop the capacity to hear it without automatically obeying its commands. You learn to recognize its familiar catastrophizing, its false dichotomies, its moving goalposts, not as truth, but as an old strategy that once helped you survive, but now limits the life waiting beyond perfectionism's narrow confines. With each recognition, each gentle redirection, you reclaim another piece of the freedom that has been yours all along. Perhaps the most profound truth about perfectionism is that it has always been a misdirection of love. Love turned inward with such intensity that it transformed from nurturing to consuming, from supportive to demanding. The perfectionist doesn't need to learn to be harder on themselves, but to redirect that profound care toward what truly matters, to love with discernment rather than desperate grasping. The journey beyond perfectionism isn't about abandoning standards, but about holding them with open hands rather than clenched fists. About pursuing excellence as an expression of your gifts rather than compensation for imagined deficiencies. In the space between who you feel you should be and who you actually are, there exists not a gap to be closed, but a life waiting to be lived. Messy, incomplete, and infinitely more meaningful than any perfect version you've been chasing. The darkness of perfectionism's prison has never been the absence of light, but the refusal to see that the door has been unlocked all along, waiting only for you to notice that you are already free to walk through it, exactly as you are. As the sun sets on our journey through perfectionism's labyrinth, remember this: your worth was never measured by the flawlessness of your performance, but by the courage with which you've carried your broken pieces. In the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the masks can finally fall away, there exists a version of yourself waiting to be embraced. Not perfect, not complete, but perfectly human in all your magnificent incompleteness. Perhaps the most profound act of rebellion in a world that demands perfection is to stand fully in your humanity and whisper, "This is enough. I am enough." And in that gentle acceptance, you may find what perfectionism always promised but could never deliver: the freedom to breathe, to create, to connect, and to live in the beautiful mess of an authentic life. The scars you've tried to hide are not marks of failure, but constellations mapping the journey of a soul brave enough to live beyond the prison of perfection. Tonight, as you rest your head, may you know that in your glorious imperfection, you have always been whole. If something in this journey resonated with your own struggle, I invite you to share your reflection in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your experience might be the very words someone else needs to hear today. If you found value in these reflections, consider subscribing to join our community of souls walking the path toward authentic living. Together, we're learning that our imperfections aren't barriers to connection, but bridges to it. From the depths of my heart to yours, thank you for sharing this moment of reflection with me. Your presence here matters more than you know.